TNKR Media.
Welcome to Today's Entrepreneur, a program about the entrepreneurial spirit that drives Quebec business, presented by FL Montreal. Dan Delmar and Mike Newton with you today. Hello, Mike.
Hey, Dan, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Pretty good, thank you. Pretty good.
Today, we're going to talk about a favorite topic among Quebecers, that is healthcare. And we're going to be speaking with Dr. Tsafrir Vanounou, CEO of TAP Medical. He's our profile on the program today. They are it's an application that allows you to book medical appointments from your phone, from a website. And they're also going to be sort of part of this Quebec-wide network, the appointment booking network that's going to be online in a few weeks. So it's a really interesting company. And Mike, begs the question, does Quebec need the private sector to jump in once in a while in healthcare? And I remember going back 10 years ago, probably when I just started hosting the show, I was very opposed to private healthcare. And then came the Showley decision. This is going back a while. And I remember, things changed then. And what that decision said essentially was that as a society, we need help. We need help to improve the healthcare system, and not relying on the private sector, at least a little bit of the time, is a mistake. And since then, everything's changed.
Yeah, it's funny. If this was TV, you would have seen me sitting here applauding the fact that we've got a successful public and private initiative going on. I mean, as much as there was a massive pushback initially against the privatization and the capitalistic approach to healthcare. There are many things that come out of it that keep everybody on their toes. And what we need to find is that balance between public and private. There is no perfect public system. There is no perfect private system. To date, there's been no such thing as anywhere close to a perfect combined system. But I think this is a really good example that we're going to hear about today in terms of taking that private money, private initiative, private business, and making it succeed for the public environment. And I got to say, it's fascinating. And I really hope that it begins a wave of future public practice and private practice initiatives. And whether that's medicine or anywhere else, I think both sides of the coin have something to learn. And if we can find a way to partner together. So this is definitely a win-win, and I hope that this is the beginning of examples and initiatives between the private and the public sector. We both have a lot to offer each other, and I do think that this is a way to go. As Canadians, we for years have put our hands up and said no to any kind of privatization, but I do think there are things to learn from the private sector when it comes to medicine and treatment and efficiency and certain models. Wastage. There's a whole bunch of things that I think the private sector can contribute, and I think there's a whole bunch of sides that the public sector can contribute in terms of compassion and understanding and putting the client first before dollars. So this is definitely a win-win to me, and I'm really happy to have this conversation today because I think it is, hopefully, at least in the healthcare sector, a really good model of a first partnership.
It's also helping workforces too, especially during the pandemic. And we're not even talking about the private delivery of the actual healthcare here. We're actually just talking about the organization, the booking, the management, and that's here the innovation that our guest will bring to the table. So we'll talk to Dr. Vanounou in a little bit. But as usual, we'll begin with some news and notes. Mike, or the thought leadership segment, as we like to call it, somewhat ironically here on today's Entrepreneur program. A couple of book recommendations. One I gave a few weeks ago, which I think is great for entrepreneurs. It's called Post-Corona: From Crisis to Opportunity. It's by Scott Galloway, who's a increasingly popular business commentator. He's on CNN now. So Post-Corona, check that out. And Mike, my next recommendation is actually not one that I've read yet, but I'm going to dig into it soon. And it just seems so relevant that we should bring up the topic, at least preliminarily. It's by an American economic journalist named Christopher Mims, and it's called Arriving Today: From Factory to Front Door, Why Everything Has Changed About How and What We Buy. Here's a quick little snippet. We are at a tipping point in retail history. While consumers are profiting from the convenience of instant gratification, rapidly advancing technologies are transforming the way goods are transported and displacing workers in ways never before seen. When we talk about the supply chain crisis, this is what we're talking about, really. Not just the coronavirus and its effects on the world economy, but these very increasingly complicated systems throughout the world that are being disrupted for a few reasons.
Yeah, I mean, again, I haven't read the book either. I've flipped through, some of the segments, and I got to say that, when it's really what we're living at this point. And let's take a step back maybe into some of this, and the supply chain component. We've just taken for granted that the goods show up on our doorstep, right? They place an order, and very few people go through the exercise of what they call the journey of the goods. So let's look at this and say whether it's manufactured in China or it's manufactured in somewhere in Alberta or somewhere in Wisconsin, the goods have to go from factory to our doorstep. The reality is we have gone from a relatively simple supply chain when North America controlled its own manufacturing, controlled its own shipping, dealt with its own time delays and its own cross-border issues, to one of it's just an immense industry, which is the journey, the time the goods leave the factory to the time they get to us. And over the years, we have sacrificed manufacturing jobs, we have sacrificed control over our goods, and to the point where ultimately now, and COVID really brought this out, and we're starting to see, and I don't know how you put a cost on it, but I think we're going to have to find a way to quantify this, is the product savings cost by manufacturing elsewhere, okay, plus the delivery and the logistics cost of getting it to you, is the cost you ultimately pay. That's the way we've always looked at it. What we haven't looked at is what is the cost associated with not having access to something when we're either being held hostage by shipping container prices or other supply chain issues getting it to our shores before we can then distribute it ourselves, same as we would from Alberta or Wisconsin. And I think we've seen this with vaccines. We've seen this with empty shelves at the store. There's a cost associated with this. So all of a sudden, this, the globalization of what we've been looking at and saving money on a manufacturing component has come home to roost to a certain degree in a supply chain environment that really has a lot of people wondering, hey, it's great that Amazon can get me my goods overnight. What is the ultimate social cost to all of this? And, the Walmarts and the Costcos of the world have become, and the Amazons have become heroes to many people. But if you dig deep, they've basically destroyed most of the small manufacturing and the small mom and pop shops along the way. What is that? What is the cost associated with that? And the goods and how they get here, we no longer have control over our goods. And as a North American consumer and a North American businessman, that worries me.
We're talking about sort of the supply chain management, but at a sort of small level. We're up against Christmas. Some people are not going to get their presents on time. Why? Why is that the case? I mean, we even if people are ordering early, why is there still, even sort of late into the pandemic, so many disruptions with the supply chain?
Well, I guess there's the for radio version, and then there's the off-air version that I can just discuss. But the reality is we're at the I guess at the whim of overseas control. And that's part of whether that's a manufacturing component, whether that's if you've seen the pictures in the port of Los Angeles of boats backed up, because they can't get to dock. There's so many factors that play into all of this. And yes, I agree with you that Christmas is coming up and people are going to be short stocked. Maybe I'm becoming a little bit of a Scrooge in my old age, but I'm less concerned about the Christmas presents and I'm more concerned about the food and the goods that people need to live. And when your Christmas presents you have to order 2 months in advance in order to get, think of what that means from a food perspective. Think of what that means from a supply on day to day for supplies for restaurants, supplies for the businesses that you work in. I mean, all of these things are all part and parcel of the same. What we're seeing is the FedExes and the UPSs are the front facing component of the supply chain. And that's what you see. What you don't see are all the various layers beforehand that are contributing to such a slow, lengthy, and lethargic process. And yes, my off-air discussion will probably revolve around being held hostage, but I guess that's a different conversation.
The thing that strikes me is not only sort of how we're all not aware of the supply chain, but we're also not aware of how it's, like you said earlier, sort of decimating the local manufacturing sector. And as much as we like to talk green and talk about supporting local business, I think we need to talk about local manufacturing. I think we need to look at areas in the East End, or Chabanel for that matter, or in the surrounding areas of Montreal, and get a concerted effort by government to reboot local manufacturing. Because if not, every time a ship gets stuck in a canal, we're gonna have a toilet paper crisis, right? We can't build an economy like this in the future.
No, I mean, what we've created in the last 50 or 60 years, and more so in the, I guess, the last 30, 40 years, is an environment of, I hate to say it because I'm one of them, a paper pusher. I mean, we've created jobs for lawyers, accountants, professionals. Yet we have taken a hit to manufacturing. We've taken a hit to the blue collar jobs that have always been the staple to our economies. Well, it's great that ultimately at the end of the day, we are creating more potentially high level professional jobs. But at what cost to our environment? At what costs to, when it takes more to ship something, obviously there's an environmental effect. When there's more packaging because it has to go further and it has to be safer, what is the environmental effect? And we all look at these things and we say, hey, so long as the economy's rolling along, we say all good as products are cheaper on the short term. And let's face it, we live in a society, or have traditionally lived in a society, which is involves two things: short term and me. And when you put those two factors together, there's a long-term cost associated with it. And when we hit a crisis like we did in COVID, and we kind of joke about the toilet paper shortage, but when we hit the crisis, now all of a sudden, what are we seeing? We're seeing the cost of living hit close to 5% in inflation. Interest rates, okay, are bearing almost zero. So if you're investing your $100 and you're almost getting no return at the end of the year, your $100 is now worth 95 cents, or $95 in order to go out and buy goods. So we're all paying the price for this. And where again do we find this break even point? That it has the soft costs associated with it, environmental, because right now we are pretty much only sitting in a soft cost estimation on environmental. We have yet to even try and quantify what this is going to look like in 2050. So all of these costs associated that we're trying to grasp have an ongoing effect that are not so easily ascertained. And for a lot of people, it's 30 years out. We'll worry about it then.
And if the supply chain issues don't get you, the labor shortage might. And plenty of local retailers, especially in the food industry, grocery, restaurants, etc., are having really, really a lot of trouble finding employees. So imagine being on both ends of the spectrum, getting hit from both sides. It's really, really tough being a retailer these days. And the crisis in terms of employment here in Montreal, Mike, it doesn't seem to be improving.
No, it's very interesting because as we start to watch the shortage in labor, I think what we're starting to see is a shift in labor, and you're starting to, one of the new, I guess, the whole concept of shifting jobs and changing the way we're doing things. So there is a labor shortage, but I think that labor shortage probably finds its way. Well, not probably, it definitely finds its way to influence all of us. But I think there are certain sectors that are hurting more than others. And, you're starting to see now a lot of the retail sector where they're going back to hiring, post 40, whether that is male or female, in many cases on a part-time basis, people that have children, that are old enough to go to school, that are coming back. So all of a sudden, you've got a shift in retail where you had a lot of younger people either going through school or kind of finding themselves, if you will, in retail, restaurants, clerk type positions, to now going back to hiring a few people that are a little bit older in all of this. And so what it does is it's a bit of a clash of the generations at this point. And we've had for years, I guess, and we'll continue to kind of joke or half joke about the millennial implication to the labor force and what that has done. If you're a believer in the psychology of the workforce, the millennials are posing a huge challenge to the Gen Xers and the baby boomers because their philosophical approach is in part similar to baby boomers, okay, in terms of making the world a better place, and we can do it together. And really at a kind of a contrast to the ongoing Gen X, you're only better served if you can do it yourself type of thing. And I think we see it in all facets. I think career goals have changed in the millennial area. I mean, a career is, when we grew up, a career was maybe one or two different careers in your life. You're looking now at a millennial group that wants experience. They want to see different things. It's part of the life journey, which means they could have 7, 8, 10 careers, never mind jobs, careers over their work span. You've got a very different desire for compensation and rewards, whether that is access to flexible time, whether that is, it was always great, when you sit down and voted somebody employee of the month, and to a Gen X or a baby boomer, and you gave them the parking spot near the door. That was sense of pride. It was a sense of accomplishment. Try offering that to a millennial today. Say, hey, I gave you the parking spot by the door, and I'm not giving you anything else to go with it. You're going to see them run out the door real quick. And I think that we all need to understand the implications. And look, I'm not going to pass judgment on what's right and what's wrong. What I'm going to pass judgment on is our inability to find the middle ground that makes it conceivable and usable for everybody, without it creating a shortage and, I guess, the market that we're sitting in right now. And unfortunately, as much as I would love to say every day needs meaningful work, there's a reality that some days work is work, and we have a job to do, and we have things to get, because ultimately we play a role in the supply chain.
And we're going to talk about finding a family doctor or any kind of healthcare professional. Our guest is creating a healthcare marketplace that allows you to book medical appointments across Quebec. And Mike, it's an interesting business, and certainly healthcare is just a primordial concern for every Quebecer and every Quebec business owner too.
100%. I mean, let's be honest, it's always a topical item. I mean, there's no way we can get away with healthcare in this province or in this country, or I guess anywhere in the world, in terms of not having healthcare at top of mind. And for those that that follow this, the government's saying there's 880,000 Quebecers without a family doctor, when in fact the health minister himself claims there's about 1.5 million that are without a GP. So we're talking about access to doctors. We're talking about trying to facilitate the process, and I think our guest today is really helping us work in that direction. And it's it's kind of a consumer based product at the end of the day. So I think this is going to be very interesting for a lot of listeners.
Indeed. And before we get to our guest, just a quick disclosure, because I have to remain transparent for my audience at CJAD. So as we mentioned on the program, today's Entrepreneur is a sponsored program. So there may or may not be business relationships between people and companies on the show. So in this case, there is a pre-existing association between our guest and my company, TNKR Media. So that said, I just wanted to make the disclosure. Let's get the conversation going, because I'm sure you'll agree that our guest is really worth hearing out. Former Harvard School of Business alum, Harvard Med School alum, came back to Montreal about 5 years ago to found TAP Medical. And just in the last little while, TAP has been selected as one of 3 exclusive providers for the Quebec government's new medical booking system. So a lot of interesting innovation happening here with TAP Medical and Dr. Tsafrir Vanounou. Dr. Tsafrir, welcome to CJAD.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity. This is wonderful.
So Dr. Vanounou, maybe just to kickstart this off, can you explain the difference between the app and telemedicine? I know once we start getting into electronic, with I guess the older generation, there's a confusion of what your app would potentially do versus what everybody hears in terms of telemedicine.
That's a great question, because there is a lot of confusion around this term telemedicine. Telemedicine means a lot. When the pandemic hit, everything, quote unquote, became telemedicine, meaning you were no longer seeing a physician face to face. You were communicating through some kind of media, whether that was a telephone, a video, or a chat. You were not in front of that physician. So by telemedicine, we mean any type of interaction that where you are and the doctor are not necessarily in the same room. That's kind of the broadest definition for telemedicine.
So your app is focused solely on booking appointments. And now I know that that sounds pretty straightforward and pretty simple, but for anybody who spent hours on the phone, either waiting to get through for an appointment or with a receptionist, maybe give us a walkthrough as to what the app does. Ultimately, the end game is to get people closer and quicker to a doctor. So maybe just give us where it came from, and what it does.
That's a great, thanks for this opportunity. Let me start off by saying that TAP Medical was created with one mission, and that was to really simplify access to healthcare. As was mentioned on the show already, it's fairly difficult to get in touch with a doctor, whether it's through telephone being put on hold or you just can't get through at all. The idea behind TAP Medical was to create a healthcare marketplace. If you think of companies like Expedia, how they transform the way we book a flight, or Airbnb, the way they transform the way we actually book a vacation rental, or Uber, the way we book a taxi, TAP Medical is trying to do the same thing for medical appointments. We want for Quebecers to be able to book an appointment simply by going onto a marketplace, viewing the different appointments available to them, and being able to book an appointment within 3 clicks. That's the challenge today, is we need to move healthcare out of this concept of calling, waiting online only to find out that there's no appointment, and increase the transparency. And that's what marketplaces do. You bring buyers, you bring suppliers into one ecosystem, and you show everybody everything that's available. And then they say, pick what's most convenient to you.
So how do you pick and decide who ends up in the system as far as, shall we call it, a supplier at the end of the day, whether that's a clinic, whether that's a private doctor, whatever the case is? How do you build that marketplace? How do you create what's there?
That's the crux of the whole problem. TAP Medical has now been around for about 5 years. We've booked about 2.4 million appointments for about 1.2 million Quebecers. Yet our biggest problem was we only had a limited availability of suppliers because TAP Medical was not used by all clinics across all of Quebec. Thankfully, this has changed over the last about year or so. The Quebec government has taken an initiative. In fact, what I believe is an amazing initiative. They've rallied together all of the doctors across Quebec and all of the clinics across Quebec and have brought them under this umbrella, what they call the Quebec Hub. Now, this Quebec Hub is what's going to create this ecosystem that we need in order to have enough supply. Because before, the problem was you would go on to tapmedical.ca, and unfortunately, if you were too late, there was no supply left. The availability of this Quebec Hub is now going to hopefully change that because the Quebec government has rallied everybody together. Hopefully, that will bring up the supply and will increase the amount of ease with which Quebecers can book a medical appointment online.
One of the more interesting parts about your operation, Tsafrir, is you've been in business for about 5 years and you're already now this preferred supplier for the government. You're one of 3 companies that are going to be the portal, the Expedia-like portal to this appointment booking hub. Just quite simply, how did you get there? That's a very short amount of time to be sort of in the club, so to speak.
Yeah, it took us a lot of work. When the Quebec government come and expressed this desire to go ahead with this idea, they kind of went out and spoke to different companies that were in the business. Thankfully, they really liked our approach. Our approach, as opposed to a lot of our competitors, or all our competitors, I would say, is that we are very user-centric. We're not focused on providing service necessarily to the clinic, but rather to the user. And they love that approach of that user-centric marketplace. We were the only ones doing it. And they really loved it. And they thought this would be a great addition to the Quebec Hub. So we were able to be selected as part of the whole kind of chosen few to be part of this. And we're staying true to our mission. Even if you look at the new tapmedical.ca, which is going to be coming live once the Quebec Hub is launched in a couple of months, we are going to be the place, the Expedia of healthcare. You'll be able to go in there, search across different specialties, different service categories, and be able to book an appointment, hopefully within 3 clicks.
So I have to assume that, based on what you've experienced, and we know that anything to do with the government can at times be political. And I guess my concern looking at it from a commercial standpoint is TAP Medical or the entire system potentially at risk to a change of government, or has this really been a commitment from Quebec to move forward to try and facilitate this?
It's an amazing question, and it's always difficult to kind of separate, what's politics versus what's really kind of quote unquote healthcare. But what I do believe is that this current government is truly dedicated to improving access in Quebec. We all know as Quebecers that access is difficult. We have wonderful healthcare, but it takes a while to get in front of the doctor. That's the problem. Our doctors are not the issue. There are simply just not enough doctors, and the way the system works is not transparent enough. You literally have to call 5 different clinics to figure out whether there's an appointment. Whereas now there's going to be a website. You're just going to go to the website and you're going to see all the appointments available. It's really what Expedia did to travel, as opposed to calling Air Canada, finding out the availabilities, and calling Continental, finding out their availabilities. Now you just go on one website and you see everybody's availabilities. So I do believe that the Quebec government is committed to doing this, whether there's going to be a change of government or not. This is something that's going to stay with us because it's needed. We all really need it and we all really want it.
So right now, the majority, I guess, of the clinics are all within the Montreal and the Montreal area that are on board. I mean, I guess you've got a few in outlying regions, but this, I guess the hub is really the city of Montreal, which obviously makes sense from a populist perspective. What is the attempt, or what is the desire to hit outlying regions and connect in those areas and try and bring healthcare to a lot of people in the region that, for them, it's not walking across the street to the doctor. It could be, hundreds of miles for them to access.
So that's the initiative of the Quebec Hub. What the Quebec Hub is really trying to do is expand outside of the big cities. Because if you really look at TAP Medical's availabilities over the last several years, it was very focused on Montreal, because that's obviously the most populous area. The Quebec Hub is really a Quebec province initiative. It's the Quebec government is bringing in doctors from Abitibi and Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean and Montreal and Laval. Everybody has the same obligation. Everybody's kind of participating within the hub. So once the hub launches and really kind of picks up steam, we should really be able to say we have a province-wide Quebec hub, which will be amazing. So wherever you live in the province, you'll be able to use tapmedical.ca or quebekhub.ca and find an appointment and go ahead and book it.
So this is access to doctors, but it's also access to nurse practitioners.
That is correct.
Okay, and I think that provides that opportunity in many more regions and many more outlying areas to touch a lot more people in this process. Again, the nurse practitioner, does that fall under the same guise or the same, call it recruiting, as you would for doctors as far as TAP Medical is concerned, or is there a different exercise for nurse practitioners?
No, it falls under primary care. As long as those nurse practitioners are within what we call primary care, which means family medicine and walk-ins, it'll fall under the same Quebec Hub kind of umbrella.
And Tsafrir, you came back from Boston and Pittsburgh from your time in the States there, having studied at Harvard, both the business school and the medical school. So a lot of people in Montreal are wondering, why'd you come back? Why didn't you stay in the States?
So I think my wife, if there's any dedication, it was, that was my proof that I loved her more than anything else. Jokingly, kind of aside, my wife and I both grew up in Montreal. We wanted to be close to our family. So that's really what drove us back here. And then honestly, it was actually, it was a wonderful return. It was great to be close to family. And it's also giving us the opportunity to kind of see Canadian healthcare in a different light. If I hadn't left, I wouldn't have seen maybe a different side of healthcare, a more user-centric side of healthcare. And my inspiration was really, can we bring that user-centric focus of American healthcare to Canada while keeping it Canadian? Because we love our healthcare, and there's some great things about Canadian healthcare.
One major change, maybe since you returned from Quebec, and I wonder if you've noticed this as well. Much more friendly to the private actors in the business, helping the system than we were even 10 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. That is an incredibly welcome change. The government no longer feels that it's got to control and manage every part of healthcare. They're now realizing that perhaps the best way of maximizing healthcare is by giving some parts of it to private industry. And that's what this whole Quebec Hub initiative really demonstrates. If you really remember, about almost 5 or 6 years ago, the Quebec government had come up with the Rendez-vous Santé Québec, the RVSQ, which was also kind of a hub idea, but purely run by the government. Unfortunately, it was a big failure. The government did not give up on the idea, but instead said, let's try it with private industry. And again, I don't think that would have happened 10 years ago. So hats off to the Quebec government for doing that.
Very interesting, though, Dr. Vanounou, when, we get into, people think of starting an app and it's, some, 18-year-old curled up in the basement designing something. And I mean, we're talking about a very sophisticated process here, as well as costing a lot of money to get off the ground. And, we just talked about Dan's question in terms of the public private partnership, but you guys built this, and the rounds of financing, none of it has come from government money. This has been pure private money at this point.
Yeah, it is. It has been. We've gone through 3 rounds of financing, all private money. One, a VC recently joined in, but the government really hasn't kind of stepped up in order to help out in this area, which is, I believe it's an unfortunate process. But the ecosystem for startups in Quebec is really beginning to blossom. It's taken a while as well, but there is a really nice ecosystem that's developing around startups, especially early startups. I still think there may be a gap in the middle financing where you're no longer in kind of a seed or really early funding, and you're not yet at the late funding. You kind of had that Series A hole that's currently existing here in Montreal and in Quebec, I would say, that we definitely experienced because our VC is actually from BC. So there really is today, I think, a hole in the financing in Montreal and in Quebec. We hope that's going to fill in with time. But nonetheless, compared to 10 years ago, the startup ecosystem in Montreal, Quebec is outstandingly improved compared to what it was.
Yeah, certainly the startup market, and certainly when you're getting into medical biotech technology, Quebec has always been at the forefront between, tax credits and a lot of other things that have gone on. The reality of the scenario is, though, and it's interesting that it's a great idea. We've got such a hub here, but you still had to BC for the VC fund. So we certainly haven't found that sweet spot yet in terms of bringing everybody together and doing what we have to do to make this a better place, especially since healthcare is at a provincial level. It's going to continue to be a bit of a challenge. How does TAP Medical see itself going forward, and this ability to work across Canada and make access for doctors, or is this going to stay pretty much a Quebec project?
Oh no, our mission is definitely to be across Canada. What we're doing right now is we're really understanding the magic formula for TAP, what works best. How do you actually build this ecosystem? And we're doing that in Quebec. But the lessons we've learned over the last 5 years of doing business primarily within Quebec, and what we're learning now with regards to this Quebec hub, we're definitely kind of wrapping that up into our magic formula, which we will then apply into different provinces. We're now realizing that the biggest problem for healthcare access right now is this concept of transparency. And this hub is an amazing way of actually reducing this kind of opacity that's in the healthcare system. How can we make it more easy for anybody to find an appointment? And a marketplace is a solution. So we're now building the pieces that we need in order to take this marketplace and bring it to Ontario, bring it to Alberta, bring it to BC, and bring it across the rest of Canada. So our vision is within the next couple of years is to be a pan-Canadian.
A few challenges here on the communications front. First, you have to tell people about it. And the other thing is you have to sort of expect medical offices and doctors to also adopt it. So tell me about the dual communications challenge there.
So that's, I'll tell you the struggle we've had over the last 5 years. The communication to the end user is fairly simple. If you tell a Quebecer, I have a hub, I have tapmedical.ca or quebekhub.ca, and you go there and you can find a medical appointment online, everybody's there. That's not an issue. The users want it. The flip was the hardest side, is how do you convince the doctors and the clinics to jump on board? Well, the answer was we couldn't. But now the Quebec government has done a lot of the heavy lifting for us. And it's interesting, but I really do have to kind of applaud the Quebec government for doing this, because I can tell you that nobody in private industry would have been able to wrangle everybody together, the doctors and the clinics. As a doctor myself, I can tell you we typically are kind of like, lone rangers. We all want to kind of do what we want to do. But the government has decided, no, we have to kind of bring everybody together into one arena for the betterment of Quebec society. And it took the government to do that. So hats off to them. And now we no longer have to worry about doctors and clinics. They have to kind of participate. And that's why we believe this Quebec hub will really take off over the coming years.
What has this meant to the doctor's office in terms of linking into the system? I mean, has this been a simple process for them? Has this involved any kind of investment, or has it just been time?
It requires some time, zero financial investment. In fact, the Quebec government's footing the bill for all the technology that's actually supporting it. And once again, the Quebec government actually went to private industry for that. They didn't try to develop that back end. Another important kind of decision on their end. So I would say that for a clinic or for a doctor, it's fairly transparent. There's zero impact. Reason more why they should not fight this process. This should be a process that should be easily adopted and embraced by clinics and doctors. It's not costing them money. It's going to cost them a little bit of time in the initial setup, but it's going to save them tremendous amount of headache. If you think about it from a point of view of a clinic, the hundreds, if not thousands of phone calls they get, these will all decrease because now people don't have to call them for an appointment. They can just go online and book an appointment. So there's a lot of benefits for clinics to adopt this system.
So let's go back across Canada, because obviously that growth component to you seems like it's going to be a very important aspect of TAP Medical. Are there other marketplaces that are already established in other provinces at this point? And if so, how do you plan on positioning yourself in order to get into a marketplace that already exists?
So the opportunity is actually that there are no healthcare marketplaces. TAP Medical was created with this concept of creating Canada's first healthcare marketplace. It's amazing. We have marketplaces for everything we do in life today, whether it's shopping, taxis, vacationing, everything else. Yet for healthcare, arguably one of the most important aspects of our life, we're still in the old world mechanism of calling. So our vision is really to grow this marketplace across Canada. And as of yet, there is nobody who is competing in the same space as we are. We are really kind of paving that way because we came at it from a different perspective. And I would say that a little bit of that American in me is really kind of what drove this idea. There is a marketplace in the US called ZocDoc. And ZocDoc, believe it or not, is booking nearly 20 million appointments every single month for Americans. And these are healthcare appointments. They have kind of proven the fact that healthcare marketplaces are incredibly successful. There's another company out in Europe called Doctolib is doing about the same thing, 15 to 20 million appointments a month. Tremendous amount of success across France and Germany. There's absolutely no reason that Canada should not have its own healthcare marketplace. And I'm dedicated to make sure that tapmedical.ca is the healthcare marketplace for Canadians.
Dr. Tsafrir Vanounou, really interesting story. And stick around. We're going to have your one piece of advice for today's entrepreneur in a moment. And speaking of that sector and the R&D credits available, selling tech, buying tech, and some of the tax implications there, let's bring in tax partner Carlo Lupo from FL. Carlo, welcome back to today's entrepreneur.
Dan, thank you very much for having me back. Last segment was surely interesting with Dr. Vanounou, and I took a few things away from that. One of the challenges today that everyone's having is reaching a target market. And what we're seeing is many businesses developing their own applications, their own platforms in order to make clients and customers their selling sites. So that brings up the issue of intellectual property. So one of the things that was great from the 2020 budget from Quebec was they introduced the incentive for deduction of the commercialization of innovations. I realize it's a mouthful, but it's the IDCI. So the IDCI provides businesses in Quebec one of the most competitive rates in North America for businesses that develop and commercially localize intellectual properties. What this effectively means is that businesses that begin after December 31st, 2020, any income attributable to that development of intellectual property is taxed at a anemic rate of 2%, which is phenomenal considering that the general rate of taxation in Quebec on business profits is 11.5%. So that's really wonderful. It's designed for businesses that have a permanent establishment in Quebec, commercialize the IP in the province, and incur research and development expenses. And really, the revenues that are generated from the intellectual property can be from the sale of goods, services, or even the outsourcing of the intellectual property. So this is all designed for the encouragement of businesses in Quebec. And that leads to a broader discussion on R&D in general, that in Canada, and especially in Quebec, R&D rates are very favorable. You're at 35% tax credit rate for scientific research and experimental development in Canada, and 30% in Quebec. So the incentivization to carry out R&D activities in the province is probably the best across Canada. In the case of Dr. Vanounou, he carries out a clinic. I've seen, and many doctors may not necessarily know this, but some of them are carrying out R&D activities without them actually being aware that they could be eligible for those credits. So I strongly encourage that any medical practitioner that is carrying out R&D activities through their clinic, I would recommend that they consult with a specialist to see if any of the projects or research that they're doing is eligible for those credits.
So you said something a couple of minutes ago that struck me, which on the tax rate is 2% on all revenue derived from the IP. Now, in an app environment, I would say probably pretty straightforward, probably pretty easy to define, where that revenue comes from. But there's a lot of businesses that are sitting with IP that it's not always clear to tell where the revenue comes from. How do you go about deciding where that source of revenue is, and obviously take advantage of a favorable tax treatment?
Well, Mike, that's a good question. First, you have to understand it has to be IP that's developed after 2020. So any existing IP that you have, generally it's internalized goodwill. It's the goodwill from years of experience, key people that you may have in a business, the owner themselves. That wouldn't necessarily qualify. So this is really targeted for businesses that have to go out and develop something. So in the case of Dr. Vanounou, he's gone out and he's developed with business partners and his own funds out of pocket, a platform to allow customers and patients alike to be able to have some direct contact with them. So it's kind of easy to make that determination because you have a product and you can identify from that product where those revenues are coming from. So in the case of, say, Dr. Vanounou, you'll have inbound patients that are coming from outside, and you'll have patients that are doing face-to-face. And I think, if you can delineate in two separate silos, revenues from one and revenues from the other, you can very easily make that determination. And I think with technology that all businesses have today, should be very easy for you to carve out that source of revenue attached to that IP.
So I'm fascinated by the post-2020 IP development. So taking an example like Dr. Vanounou, who's had this business going on for 5 years now. I mean, there's IP that was developed before the new deadline. There's IP that's developed afterwards. How and what do we look at it? Is it when this is commercialized? How do you determine when to use the 2% and how much? I mean, if he's been in business for 5 years and this is 1 year, does he only take 20% of that number? How do you define this? Is there a grandfather component to it?
Unfortunately, like most credits, whenever credit is introduced, it's after that date. So anything that's prior doesn't you're not caught with the implementation of a credit. So unfortunately, if you were developing something before the implementation of a credit, it's kind of a too bad situation, unfortunately.
Carlo Lupo, tax partner at FL. Thanks very much, Carlo.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and we'll speak next time in the new year.
And as we do at the end of every show, let's turn to our guest, Dr. Tsafrir Vanounou, CEO of TAP Medical, and ask him for his one piece of advice for today's entrepreneur, sir.
Oh, my piece of advice is fairly simple. Expect it to be much harder than anything you can imagine, and you have to be ready to do anything that's needed in order to kind of stay alive and afloat for long enough to catch on. I never would have dreamt 5 years ago that entrepreneurship would have been this difficult. I thought medical school was difficult. Forget about it. This is 10 times harder and 10 times more volatile and unpredictable. But you have to be ready to do whatever is needed in order to keep your head above water and survive. If you believe in your idea and you believe that eventually people will believe in your idea, you got to live long enough for that persistence. And persistence means you got to fight and be ready to fight. It's going to be a long slog, but it's all worth it at the end.
And Mike, I'm struck by how quickly Tsafrir got in there and got into, what we could describe as Quebec Inc. or a really select group of companies to help Quebec modernize healthcare. It's a really impressive story.
Most definitely, and obviously the transparency in a rather opaque system in and of itself is a major accomplishment. But be able to get this kind of para-public and private-public partnership, and every other side of partnership going on this is huge. And I'm really curious and really looking forward to seeing this outside the boundaries of Quebec, going across Canada, because I do feel that we are bringing possibly some of the better aspects of U.S. healthcare into a Canadian system that, as Dr. Vanounou said, we all cherish. So, if we can bring the best of both worlds together, and this is the start of it, I got to say, hey, hats off, and let's keep it going.
There was a Supreme Court decision a while ago, about a decade ago, called the Shaoli decision, which really changed things for Quebec healthcare. And all of us admitted with that decision that we need help. We need the help of the private sector to bring us all up to speed. So I think that's an important lesson. Thanks very much to Dr. Tsafrir Vanounou, CEO of TAP Medical. And so, Mike, wishing you and all our listeners a great holiday season and a prosperous new year. Today's Entrepreneur will be back in January and starting the year roaring with Anne-Marie Trudeau from Trudeau Corporation. So they are the kitchen and houseware company that we see all over the place. Product design, development, selling these products around the world. That's all coming up on our first show of the new year. A reminder, you can subscribe to Today's Entrepreneur as a podcast on iHeartRadio, iTunes, or your favorite platform, Spotify too. And go over to today'sentrepreneur.org for hundreds of local entrepreneur stories from the last 13 years. All the best, Mike. See you soon.
All the best to you and your family. Thanks.
This has been a production of TNKR Media. Good talk.